Okay, so today what we're going to briefly talk about, or what we're going to start talking about today, is what sociology is. And then I'm going to give you some other concepts that are important in sociology. And then I'm going to take a moment to kind of, this may sound silly, help give you instructions on how to read, in particular read stuff in this class. So that you guys aren't spending too much time doing work at home. So in terms of defining what sociology is, if we were to use an intro textbook, they'd provide a definition. And if you look online, and feel free to test me on this when you get home. Here we go. Feel free to test me on this when you get home. The definitions often don't seem to have very much to do with one another, meaning that people will often define it very differently, which is kind of weird, right? Because often you start out classes and you get a definition of what the subject matter is. For sociology, it kind of seems like a difficult thing to explain. And part of the reason why is that sociology is different from a lot of fields, that it's more of a way of thinking than it has a set thing that it studies. And in fact, if you were looking at the syllabus, there's all sorts of things on the list of things that you would study. One week we talk about crime, one week we talk about families, one week we talk about culture, right? These are vastly different things. So there's one on the environment, there's one on technology, right? These are all very different things. What stays the same across them is how sociologists are going to think about it. And so sociology has no object that it studies. This makes it different than a lot of sciences. So, if we just think about some of them, like, what does biology study?
Study life.
What's that?
Study life.
It's a study of life. It's right in the word, right? Bios, life. What does astronomy study? Space, right? These are very easy, tangible things that you can just say, this is what it studies. Did I just shut off?
No, it's fine.
Just making sure. I just heard a beep. Got paranoid. And then, same things like meteorology studies weather, right? Sociology doesn't have a specific thing like that. So I think the clearest definition to get into what it is to think like a sociologist, or how it is that sociologists attack what they look at, is offered by somebody by the name of C. Wright Mills. Who wrote a book called The Sociological Imagination. And C. Wright Mills said that sociology attempts to look at things through time, space, and social structure. So when we get to kind of the end of this, what we'll see is that in a lot of ways sociology studies the world holistically. And what I mean by that is that it has a tendency to bring a lot of things together. In a lot of ways, each of these have their own discipline. Sociology is the one that kind of pulls it all together and provides a context for pretty much anything that human beings think, do, or say. Right? So another way, and we'll kind of round back to this, another way to think about sociology, a good definition that I like, is that sociology is the study of the context, right, of the things that people think, do, and say. Okay, so what might we mean by thinking about something through time? What would be another word we'd use for might you think that means?
Study of an era,
What do you mean?
like the medieval era, the ancient era, the Renaissance era, the modern era, stuff like that.
Yeah. So you could say that like when we try to understand things through time or understand them historically, often sometimes through these like big shifts, right? Like this big shift that happens from medieval to the modern. And actually a lot of sociologists, when you read through it and you start talking about it, a lot of sociologists are really interested in how modernity affects things, right? That's one of the things that sociologists get really hung up talking about. Why is that? They're thinking through time. Yeah, that would be an example. What would we often call thinking through time? If we were to attach another discipline to it. There's another discipline that very clearly does this. History, yeah. So thinking through time is thinking historically, right? So one thing that sociologists, and you're going to find that like a good chunk of the articles we read will often start with talking about something in the past, getting you up to the present of what they're talking about, right? To understand the present, we have to understand the past. We have to understand things through time. One thing we have to avoid in sociology, and this is a good catchword, and you'll probably hear me drop this word quite a bit. We have to avoid explanations that are trans-historical. As a general rule, people think that what their experience of the world is universal to every other human being. For most things that we can think of, that's not going to be true. So most things change across time. The way in which, so how you can think about it like, how do you get a job today? What sort of things do you do to get a job? Yeah, you go to school and prepare to get a job.
Interview,
What else do you do?
have a resume.
You need experience.
You try to get experiences, you build your resume, you write up a resume, you go and interview. Is this how people have generally found their work throughout history? How else might people have found their work across time?
Through the trade of their parents.
Josephine?
Yeah, because they're relative.
Yeah, often like if we're thinking about like, you mentioned, I like using the Middle Ages as sort of like a leaping off point, right? If you think back in the Middle Ages, a lot of things were familially inherited. Like you learned, right, your craft through your parents. You learned what you did. A lot of societies did that, right? So you have a very different experience of thinking about employment, picking a job than people in those societies. But if we go back even further, we had societies where often like people only really do one thing, right? So like if you're in like cultural anthropology class, we offer cultural anthropology. I think it's called sociology of culture still. It's actually going to change its name, but we offer a cultural anthropology class here. And if you were in that class, essentially what you talk about would be like hunting and gathering societies. Everybody in a hunting and gathering society hunts and gathers, right? There might be some gender division of labor, but by and large, everybody does the same thing. Pastoralists, what you could call herders. They all herd. That's what they do. Their entire society is built around it, right? So your experience of work, we have a tendency to think, and if we're not really being in a concerted way thinking about it, or looking back into the past, we have a tendency just to assume that something like how I got work, or we can even think about like how we find our partners that we marry, right? Like the place of romantic love. There's whole literature on how like romantic love is really this modern invention. It doesn't date back very long. Like the idea that you would fall in love with your partner, which is really just code for sexual attraction, is like the idea of how to find a mate is really foreign to most places and times, right? That experience isn't trans-historical. It's very specific to our own time, right? So that's how you'd see the world through time. Something very, and this is very related, very similar, is understanding the world through space. What do you think we might mean by that? What does it mean to understand the world through space?
Where you are in the world?
Yeah, where you are on the globe has a lot to do with your experience, right? Cultures change over space, even to this day. So the same way that across time, right, experiences don't carry over, so understanding the context is important. Across space, you have to understand the context of where you live. You could think about even things like, has anybody ever traveled to other countries at all? What countries have people been to? You can just holler out.
Mexico.
Mexico.
UK.
Did people notice any difference in how people interacted? What are some differences people noticed? What did people, in the way they spoke and talked, act differently?
So I have a friend called Susan Paris, and we visited her for the last year during the summer. And the way they greeted me was like kissing me on each cheek, and that was just something that was really foreign to us and kind of awkward at first, but it was just interesting to see that it was something that was so normal to them.
It was kind of the opposite in the UK, in London specifically. And people there, of course, like they care about family and they care about each other as human beings. So they're not gonna hug you if you're just acquaintances or just, friends, like regular friends. They're much more formal about that type of thing.
Yeah.
And coming from the South, very different, especially. Like I hug people in person, except for now.
Yeah. So we all have these different ways of interacting. And some of them are so subtle we wouldn't even think about it. So like, I know that I always think about this because like I moved around a fair amount, and like eye contact and whether eye contact is appropriate is really culturally specific, but most people don't realize it, right? So like, if you move, has anybody here ever moved between like rural and urban areas, countries and cities? Like in cities, you don't make eye contact with people. It's kind of rude. When I studied in Germany, I was only there for 3 months, so I don't count that as like living someplace. When I studied in Germany, you could look at somebody, but you couldn't acknowledge them. At least the part of Germany that I was in. So like if you were on the bus, it was perfectly fine to stare at somebody. So you'd be sitting on the bus across from somebody and they'd be like, and it's almost like they're just looking through you. They're not really thinking about you, but if you acknowledge them and we're just like, that's taken us really forward, and people get put off by it. And so like, it's really, at least that's what it was like in Marburg. So like, you think about like, I'm from the Midwest, like you're always nodding at people, you're always acknowledging their existence. It's a big thing culturally. It took every ounce of me to be okay with somebody looking at me and not responding in some way, right? But that's just like, it would sound rude, it's just this subtle difference. So often the things that we do cut across space, right? But once again, like, unless you move around, and this is actually why people, like I think travel is good for people if you're going to learn to get along with other people. And it's exactly why, is because if you just stay in one space your whole life, you may not realize all the little ways in which space affects you. Okay, last is social structure. This one's probably a little. Does anybody know that just what the discipline that studies space is? In sociology or in academia, there's a specific study of space. It'd be geography. So geography studies space. Okay, social structure. Social structure is the institutional context for our lives. So by social structures, we mean that there are institutions that surround us that affect us in various ways. And so they might affect us because we live in different institutions than people. It might affect us because we're in different places within the same institution. So can somebody think of it as what might be an institution? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, it's not that. Like, institution is such a broad term. I just want to like get a better understanding of
Oh, yeah.
like what you're going for there with institution.
We're working our way there. So I was just writing it on the board first, and then does anybody want to venture at, like, what might be an example of an institution that we live in?
Could it be like a church? Like a church or like Catholic church, Protestant church, those would be institution?
Yeah, that could be a good example. Different religions. A religion could be an example of an institution.
Yeah.
Both in sociologists, it gets a little bit hard because we both mean this in big and small ways. So, like, your individual congregation could be an institution, but so could be the Catholic Church,
Right.
or the Christian faith, or Islam. Could be institutions that people live within. And those different contexts, what kind of religious institutions you interact with, if any, or if you don't interact with them, are going to become very different contexts for the way in which you live and view other people and do things, right? So that would be an example. Can anybody think of examples of other things that might be institutions?
A country.
Yeah, we all exist within governments. Thinking, well, we'll get into that probably later. But anyways, yeah, we all exist within governments. Those governments provide very different contexts for our lives, right? Depending on the rules that they set. Life here is very different from life in Canada. Even though, like, I grew up, like, literally, like, Canada is where, 18-year-olds would go to drink because it was legal in Canada. So it was like high schoolers would just drive across the border. Yeah, very different institutional contexts in which you live from one to the other. The way in which healthcare works, the way in which people are provided, for, the way in which, right, things like, so when I applied for this job, I was applying for a variety of jobs, and I remember applying for one in Medicine Bow, Alberta, and it was the college in Medicine Bow. But one of the things that came up in the interview is that everybody gets, if they have a child, 8 months maternity leave. Regardless of whether you're male or female, you get 8 months off, paid maternity leave. Nobody gets that in the United States. That's just Canadian law. I can't remember. It was a long period of time, right? I met a guy when I was in Senegal who was from a Scandinavian country. I can't unfortunately remember which, right? And they, like, for certain positions, like, they give people, right, years off. So you can take a 3-year vacation, paid vacation. Right? And he was driving from his family. He drove all the way from, I think it was Denmark, to Senegal. Right? He was just going to, like, tour Africa and the Middle East and then drive back, right? Totally different context in terms of, this wouldn't be government, this would be an example of economic context, right? The companies in which we work for. Very different social context. So it changes the way in which we live and view things, but also our places within it. So, like, probably the classic example in sociology would be social class, right? How wealthy you are, or how wealthy you are, like where you fall within the economy, affects your experience of reality a lot, right? You're going to see a lot of things in this class that will come up a lot in articles about how that works, right? So there's stuff like that. Or we could think too, like, I've been thinking about this a lot, because like, we both exist in the same institution here, right? We both exist at the same college. And, like, we're going through something that nobody's ever really gone through here, right? Teaching the way that things are being done right now is new for me, it's new for you, right? But we exist in very different contexts in some ways at this institution because of our different roles within it, because of our different positions. So, like, constantly have to think about how my decisions are going to affect you, right? Try to see things from your guys' point of view a lot, right? Because of that, right? Because of the different contexts. So there's some period we innately do something like a sociological analysis, but the sociologists just purposely doing it.
Can you remind me what the space one was again? Space, what was it again?
For space?
Yeah.
Space is like geographical space.
Oh, okay.
So it's like, where you live on the globe. If you think of it that way.
And in year and after, so that's why.
Yeah, totally understandable.
Yeah.
So, any other questions? You guys kind of feel like you have a grasp of it? You guys feel like so moving forward, what we're basically going to see is this kind of way of thinking being applied to all kinds of things. And that's really kind of the backbone of the course, is that viewpoint, what sometimes literally referred to as the sociological imagination. Or thinking sociologically. And kind of the fun thing about that is like sociology is like both foreign and familiar all at once, right? It's a different way of thinking than we normally want to do, but the things that we actually end up talking about sometimes are often things that we're very close to. Okay. I'm going to talk about one more thing about sociology, which actually is good because the language, this part of the language of sociology actually is true of most sciences as well, but it'll help us when we go to read the articles to think about it too. And that is two terms that we should talk about, which are kind of the tools that sociologists use to do their analysis, which is theory and method. So I'm just throwing this out there. Does anybody have any context for understanding? Have anybody seen these worlds? Have a different example of when you've seen either the word theory or method, or just in everyday language? We don't have to do them in any specific order.
Like scientists have theories on like how the world started, or like theories on different things.
Yeah. So theories on how the world started. So you're thinking like the Big Bang Theory kind of thing. So what's the Big Bang Theory? How does that work?
Me?
Yeah. What is it?
We just kind of think that people just can, like, it doesn't have to do a lot with religion.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, and that's how, like, to some degree, we could, just sort of step aside from that. Think about like those ideas. So, go ahead.
Actually, I mean, the way that people understand the Big Bang Theory now, like, is aside from religion, but it was, the theory was put forth by a Catholic monk from back. Anyway, the theory is that everything in the world originated from one point in space.
Yeah.
And that something set it off, and then the universe came to be.
Yeah, and so essentially what you have is you have astronomers make a certain observations, like the movement of planets, and then somebody comes up with this larger, overarching explanation that makes sense of it, right? And then they use that as a way of generating what they should test next, what they should do. That's how science is generally oriented. They construct overarching explanations, which they call theories. Sociology does the same thing. Sociology, there is a plethora of theories. Almost every week we're going to be looking at different theories. Partially because we look at so many different things, right? But they're large, overarching explanations. And despite how complicated the language of theory often is, which it is, one thing that differentiates it from the rest of what sociologists are going to do is generally our theories are sort of written in actual, like what we could call actual language. It's a complicated language, but like you can sit down and read it in English, right? And it's English. It's actually, so like we'll get some texts that are purely theoretical in here. There is no actual study being done. And what they're basically doing is they're doing theory construction. Right? And